Is your life having any impact on those around you? Hi, I'm Bill Wright. There's a method we humans use to preserve food using salt. In the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus teaches that we are the salt of the earth and the light of the world. Now that seems to be quite a responsibility. Pastor Dick Woodward continues in his series entitled The Sermon on the Mount.
You are the salt of the earth. But if the salt loses its saltiness, how can it be made salty again? It is now good for nothing except to be thrown out and trampled under the feet of men. You are the light of the world. A city that is set on a hill cannot be hidden, and neither do men light a candle and put it under a bushel. Instead, they put it on a candlestick, and it gives light to everyone in the house. In the same way, let your light so shine before men that they may see your good works and glorify your Father who is in heaven. I've just read Matthew chapter 5, verses 13 through 16, and we are in a verse-by-verse study now of the Sermon on the Mount, and this passage of Scripture that I've just read from kind of turns a corner in the teaching of the Sermon on the Mount. We have seen in our previous studies that the 8 Beatitudes with which the Sermon on the Mount begins, in the opinion of many scholars, are the sermon. They are the teaching. And all the rest, they say, is application. Having given us the 8 Beatitudes, Jesus begins the application really at verse 11, when he used the personal pronoun you so many times and said, "Blessed are you when people insult you and persecute you and falsely accuse you and accuse you of all kinds of evil because of me. Rejoice and be glad, because great is your reward in heaven, for in the same way they persecuted the prophets who were before you." Many feel that's where the application actually begins. Perhaps another way of summarizing at this point would be to say that in the 8 beautiful attitudes, Jesus challenged us to look in and see if by the grace of God there is in us the character that is Christ-like, which really is the thing that's going to make us part of his solution and part of his answer. And then when the application begins, it's as if Jesus is saying, now look around. Look at your world. Look at the people in your world. And appreciate the challenge involved when the kind of character that God by his grace is working in you impacts the culture or the world. We looked at the first part of this look around in our last study when we examined the words, "You are the salt of the earth." What did Jesus mean by that? Well, we suggested several possibilities, but notice he didn't say you have the salt for the earth. He said it's something you are. You are the salt of the earth. And he also said if you're not salt, then you're good for nothing. What an awesome challenge verse 13 is. Now, having considered what he meant by that first metaphor, you are the salt of the earth, now let's consider a second one, because he gives us 4 illustrations here. Let's look at the second one. You are the light of the world. Now again, as we examine this statement, we see Jesus saying something about the world and something about his disciples. When he said to his disciples, you, and the implication by the words are, you and you alone are the salt of the earth. We said in our last study that he was making a statement about the world and about his disciples. He was saying perhaps, the world is corrupting, and you alone are the influence that's going to preserve the world from corruption. Or if what he meant by that illustration was that no human organism can live without salt, and so you are the life-giving principle that's going to give real life, eternal life, to the people in the world, then again he was making a statement about the world and about his disciples. He was saying the world doesn't have the quality of life that God meant for them to have. And if they're ever going to find that quality of life, which John called eternal life, They're going to find it through the disciples of Jesus. What a tremendous value to place upon his disciples. Now, as he turns to them in verse 14 and says again to the disciples, and this is implied by the Greek word that's translated you, you and you alone are the light of the world. Then here again he's making a statement about the world, and he's making a statement about his disciple. The world is in darkness, he's saying, and you alone are the light that God the Father wants this world to have. Now this is an awesome thing to say about the world and about his disciple. We've had ages in history that have been referred to as the Age of Enlightenment. Enlightenment is a word that's been used many times throughout history to represent the fact that there have been explosions of knowledge at certain times in the history of the world, and we certainly are in the midst of one now. If you study these things, you know that there is more known today, and in this last 50 years, more has been discovered in the way of truth that have led people to call the time in which we're living now a knowledge explosion or an information explosion. In some ways, you might call this age in which we're living an age of enlightenment. And yet for all the information that's being discovered and all the knowledge that's been acquired in the last half century, Jesus says the world is in darkness. The world doesn't really know. Now, are we going to say that that was only for his day 2,000 years ago? I hardly think so, because even though there's a lot of information and a lot of knowledge today, the great challenge is, what do you do about what you know? The problem where darkness and light are concerned is not necessarily information. What Jesus meant by darkness is not perhaps an absence of information or knowledge. It's light in terms of the truth that has to do with the application of all that information and all that knowledge. It seems that for all our knowledge today, we still don't know what to do about the great problems, the truly great problems that continue to confront the world. If we can believe Jesus as he teaches here on the mountaintop, he's really saying, and I believe it's just as true today as it was 2,000 years ago, he's saying to his church, he's saying to his disciple, his genuine disciple, his real disciple who really understands his teaching, the truth that he was and the truth that he taught, his values and his philosophy about this world and about life and how life is to be lived. If we understand just the teaching of the content of this Sermon on the Mount, then I believe we can see that the application is still true today. The disciple of Jesus, the true, genuine disciple of Jesus, and he alone is the light this world needs. The world is still in darkness, spiritual darkness, and it's the true disciple of Jesus who has the light that this world desperately needs. That's still true today. Now, in connection with this concept of the disciple being light, it's good to notice the order in which Jesus used these two illustrations. First, he said to the disciple, and again I think it's all conditioned on the fact that the Beatitudes have been worked into the life of the disciple. If these attitudes are in you, then you and you alone are the salt of the earth, perhaps meaning the life-giving principle the world needs, perhaps meaning the force that's going to preserve the world from its spiritual and moral corruption. But after saying, you are the salt of the earth, then he says, you are the light of the world. Some scholars see a real significance in this order. If you are, by the grace of God, the salt of the earth, then it's possible that when people see what you are, and it's all by the grace of God, of course, but if they see that you really are the salt of the earth, then, like Nicodemus, they will come to you at some point, and they will want to know why you are the way you are. They will want to hear your religious talk. Remember in John chapter 3, Nicodemus came to Jesus, and he opened his interview with Jesus with the words, "I've seen the works you do, and so I've come to hear what you have to say." In so many words, that's the way the interview between Jesus and Nicodemus began. We said when we studied that 3rd chapter of John that it's still that way today, and I believe it is. If what we are, by the grace of God, if we're salt, if that impresses people, the time will come when, like the Philippian jailer, they will give their own invitation, and they'll want to know why we are the way we are. And that's when we have a chance to share the light that has been given to us, the truth that we believe and apply, that God uses to make us the salt of the earth. It seems to be the order still today, just as it was in the time of Jesus. And perhaps knowing that, that's why he put these two illustrations in this order. You might put it this way: if you are the salt of the earth by the grace of God, then you are also the light of the world. And the time will come when you'll have a chance to preach or teach or share how it is with you and why it is with you the way it is with you. We seem to think today that the order is reversed. We seem to think that the world's going to be impressed with our preaching and our teaching and our theology and our doctrine, and then perhaps one day we'll get around to what we are. I think that's reversing the order. The order is still this way. First, we must be. We must be the salt of the earth by the grace of God. And then the next thing will be, we'll have a chance to be the light of the world. Now, in connection with this concept of our being the light of the world, we have two more illustrations. A city that has been set or built or placed on a hill cannot be hidden. If a city were built on the top of a mountain, there is no way that city could be hidden. It is said of Jesus in the Gospel of Mark that he could not be hidden. Sometimes he tried desperately to get away from the multitudes of people that were constantly thronging him, seeking him, actually trying to lay their hands on him. In one place in the Gospel of Mark, it says he was just about smothered by the multitudes of people who came to him because their need for him and for what he was and what he had for them was so desperate. And at times he tried to get away from them, but it says he could not be hidden. Now, I think he's saying to these disciples who came to this first Christian retreat because they wanted to be part of his solution and part of his answer, I think he was saying, now, if these beautiful attitudes are in your life by the grace of God, and if by the grace of God you are the salt of the earth and the light of the world, then it will be impossible for you to hide it. If by the grace of God you are a real disciple of mine, and you have my real values, and you believe the truth that I came to show and tell, if by the grace of God you really believe the gospel that I'm committing to you, you will not be able to hide it. Now you think about this for a minute. Let's suppose you're a disciple of Jesus, and you go to work, and let's say you're the only disciple of Jesus in the whole office, or perhaps in that whole factory, or perhaps in your neighborhood, or whatever. Think of yourself being placed in a community, and you're a disciple of Jesus. How long do you think you're going to be able to conceal the fact that you're a disciple of Jesus? I once heard about two men who worked together. They worked together in an automobile agency selling automobiles. They came to a breakfast that I had for businessmen, and when they showed up at this breakfast, which was really a Bible study kind of breakfast, they were both shocked to see the other one there. And they exclaimed as they met each other at the breakfast, "Are you a Christian?" Now, these men worked together all day, sometimes, long hours. They worked at least 12 hours a day, and much of that time stood around with no customers and nothing to do but talk with each other. And yet, even though they'd done that for a couple of years, neither one knew the other one was a Christian. Well, I think Jesus is suggesting here, that if you really are a true follower of His, it will not be possible to conceal it or to hide it. If you met the Apostle Paul for even just a half an hour, suppose you waited for a bus with the Apostle Paul, or suppose you perhaps were sitting next to him on a plane, how long do you think you'd be next to the Apostle Paul before you knew that he was a disciple of Jesus Christ? Well, Jesus seems to be suggesting here, if you are the real thing, if you are the salt of the earth, not the salt that isn't salty, that's good for nothing, but real salt. If you're a salty disciple, in other words, then you are the light of the world. And if you are, by the grace of God, the salt of the earth and the light of the world, you will be like a city on a hill that cannot be hidden. You will not be able to hide the fact that you are a disciple of Jesus Christ. How long is it in general society before some issue comes up, some moral issue involving what's right or what's wrong, and then the disciple of Jesus has to run his flag up? How long is it at a water cooler before the risque stories are told and the disciple of Jesus cannot just guffaw and break up at the risque joke? How long is it really in some kind of a context of society before the fact that the believer is a disciple of Jesus is exposed? I think Jesus is predicting that it wouldn't be very long. In fact, I think he's saying it will be impossible for you to hide the fact that you're one of my disciples. Perhaps that's what he meant by that illustration in connection with being the light of the world. A city that's been set or built or strategically placed on a hill or a mountain cannot be hidden. Now in verse 15, he gives us another great illustration. Neither do men light a candle and put it under a bushel. They put it on a candlestick, and it gives light to everyone in the house. What a great illustration this is. Remember again, in the Gospel of John, in chapter 15 and verse 16, in the upper room, Jesus turned to the apostles, men he met for the most part at this first Christian retreat. At the last Christian retreat, which we call the Upper Room Discourse, he turned to these men and he said, "You have not chosen me, but I have chosen you, and ordained you that you should go and bring forth fruit that remains, so that whatever you ask the Father in my name, he may be able to give it to you." In John 15:16, that word ordained is not the same word that we use when we speak of ordaining a minister. It's a Greek word that's found 3 times in the New Testament, and it means to be strategically placed, the way a general would strategically place his troops in a field around an objective. Jesus said to those men in John 15:16, "I have strategically placed you that you might be fruitful." Now here you have the same concept in this beautiful illustration. He's saying, you're the salt of the earth, you're the light of the world, you're like a city built on a hill that cannot be hidden, and you are like a candle on a candlestick. What a beautiful illustration this is. In those days, of course, they didn't have electricity, and so they used candles. And this was a very common, ordinary, everyday illustration. When you light a candle, Jesus was asking, perhaps with a sense of humor, do you put it under a bushel? Some versions say under a bed. Do you put it under something? No, of course you don't. You put it on a candlestick in a prominent place in the house, and then that candle gives light to the whole house. Well, what he's saying is this: the world is in darkness, and you who have come to me, who have come to embrace the truth and the values I brought into this world, it's as if you're a candle that wasn't lighted before I met you, but now that I've met you, and you've met me, the encounter you have had with me is going to light up your life. It's going to light your candle. Perhaps speaking of regeneration, the new birth, as the candle lighting, he says, whenever I light a candle, I have a candlestick for every candle I have lighted. You wouldn't light a candle and put it under a bed or under a bushel, and neither do I. Now that I've lighted the candle that you are, I have a candlestick for every one of you. I frankly think that should make the life of every believer exciting. I remember hearing a sailor say one time, because I was pastoring a church in a Navy town, "Pastor, I'm the only follower of Christ on my whole ship, and there are hundreds of men on my ship." I remember exclaiming to him, "Isn't that wonderful? Just think of all the darkness on that ship and how bright your candle is going to shine, because it's the only light in that whole ship." You see, a candle shines brightest where it's darkest. You think of a chandelier like they used to have with 1,000 candles on it. Suppose one of those candles was the candle that you are. Well, your light wouldn't be very significant on a chandelier with 1,000 other candles. But if you took that little light that you are, that little candle that you are, out into some corner of the darkness somewhere, think of how much more valuable that light would be. Well, if you were on a ship with 500 sailors and you were the only believer, just think how strategically placed the candle that you are would be. If that's true in the office where you work, or the store, or the school where you teach, or the neighborhood where you live, well, just think of how exciting that should make your life. I believe, in the light of this illustration, every follower of Christ should feel that wherever he or she works, or lives, or socializes, or even goes to church, they should feel that these things are their candlestick, and that they're not there by accident. They have been strategically placed there by the Lord Jesus Christ, like a candle that's been lighted and then placed on a candlestick. You see, real Christianity, when you get down to the essence of it all, down to the reality of it all, it involves an encounter with the Christ who is, an encounter that is so real and so vital. It's as if before you had this encounter, before you met him, you were like an unlighted candle. But now that you've met Christ, he lights up your life. He lights your candle. But once he lights your candle, it's not just so that your candle might be lighted. It isn't just for you. It is for you. He loves you, and it is for you. But it isn't just for you. Once the candle that you are has been lighted, now the next issue is, where's the candlestick on which he wants to place this candle that you are? You see, his strategy is expressed in verse 16. "Let your light so shine before men that they may see your good works and then glorify your Father in heaven." This is another great verse taken from this great teaching we call the Sermon on the Mount. There's a sense in which it's your light, but we know that the one who lighted the candle was not you yourself, it was Christ. So there's a sense in which it isn't your light, it's his. But it's the light that he wants you to be. So he refers to it as your light. "Let your light so shine before men that they may see your good works and then glorify your Father in heaven." In other words, as men behold you giving off light on this candlestick, as this candle that you are burns, people will look at this light that you are, and they won't be drawn to you as an end. They'll be drawn to you and then directed to your Father, because they'll know that you're not responsible for the fact that that light is burning. There's so many things in all these illustrations of Jesus. In order for a candle to give off light, it has to expend itself. There's no way that the candle can stop burning itself up and still give off light. If it's going to let its light shine, it has to expend itself. The only way it could cease this expending of itself would be to snuff out the light. But there's no way it can shine and still preserve itself. In other words, we have to expend ourselves in order for the light to shine. Well, he says, once you've found the candlestick that I have chosen for you, then burn there, burn up there, burn out there for me, and give off light, light that will draw men not to yourself, but to the Father. Light that will perhaps attract their attention. They'll say, there's something extraordinary about that person, something unusual about that person, and it couldn't be explained just by that person. When they come to behold your good works, which is your light, of course, then they'll be directed to glorify the Father in heaven, who is the source and the power behind it all. In these verses, having told us to look in the Beatitudes, Jesus is saying, now look around. Look around at your world and consider the challenge involved when the kind of character you have in you by the grace of God impacts a culture that's corrupting, a culture that doesn't have life, a culture that is in darkness.
Thank you for listening to the Sermon on the Mount series presented by our teacher, Pastor Dick Woodward. Our hope is that you will grow in the knowledge of the Scriptures and discover their devotional meaning as it applies to your life. This is part of the Mini Bible College, a ministry of International Cooperating Ministries.